Hello and welcome to this revision presentation about HTML and CSS. So the first topic we look at when we're designing our website is to actually do some planning. It's very important to spend some time on the basic layout of your website before you get stuck into coding it. So the first thing that you should be doing is designing a sitemap with pen and paper, something that shows you what your pages are going to be about and how they're going to be linked together. You should have some wireframes done up which show the intended layout of each page, and they also show how to navigate between pages. And you should have wireframes that show you how the layout will differ on different devices such as an iPad or a mobile phone or a laptop. You should also spend some time thinking about your file structure, how you're going to store your work. So think about your folders. It's a good idea to have CSS in its own folder and maybe images in their own folder. Your basic homepage should be in the top level folder. And then you should also be thinking about what tools you're going to use to design your website with. So basic text editor like Notepad++ is ideal. But sometimes you might need to have server-side JavaScript, for instance, which case you might need to use a cloud-based service such as Glitch. So HTML is not a programming language. It's hypertext markup language, so it is a markup language. It's used to put structure on a web page that your browser will later translate into a web page. So every HTML document should actually begin with the declaration, which is angle brackets, exclamation mark, doctype, HTML, close your angle brackets. And then following that, you should have your HTML element, and nested inside the HTML element is the head element and the body elements. So they're the basic elements that every web page should have. There are other elements, of course, that add extra structure to your page, like headings and paragraphs. And in the small picture there, colored picture, you can see that there are other images or other elements still, such as headers and footers, that can add even more structure to your page. HTML5 is the current version of HTML, and declaring your document at the beginning with that declaration actually declares your document to be of version 5. Version 5 is designed to work across multimedia and multi-platforms. So here you can see the structure of a HTML element. Every element has some content which is surrounded by opening and closing tags for that element, or at least most elements are. There are a few tags which have no content. They're referred to as empty tags. The image tag for insert pictures is an example of one of those. An element might contain a number of attributes listed between the angled brackets of the opening tag, and attributes take the format shown, which is an attribute name followed by an equals sign. That is then followed by the value of the attribute inside quotation marks. So the examples given here, we have two. The first one there is the source, which shows where to find the image that we're looking to insert. And the second tag is the anchor tag, which is the basic hypertext tag. And inside the opening anchor tag, you can see the href attribute, which is the hyperreference, and it's the location where you go to when you click on that hyperlink. If you have multiple attributes within the one opening tag, that's perfectly fine as long as you separate them with spaces. So why do we bother with page structure at all? Why is it so important that we mark up our documents? So the main uses of the markup is things like individuals will scan websites very quickly looking for the information that they're after. The idea of HTML5 is to make a web page easy to read. And not just by humans, search engines also want to read pages, and visually impaired people will use screen reader software which will read the markup as well. Other reasons for including structure in a web page is so that you can team it up with your CSS and your JavaScript. The CSS is used for styling your web page, and the JavaScript is used to make it dynamic or interactive. And they can't do that if there isn't any HTML markup. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. You can add style directly into HTML using the style attribute, but CSS3 has allowed us to separate out our style into its own documents, so into separate style sheets. The advantage of that is so that we can have one central place for if we want to change the style of a web page, we only need to change one source instead of going to every individual page on the site. And the second advantage is once the CSS is separated from the HTML can actually work better. So CSS is built from declarations where we have a property separating a colon and a value. So the property, for example, background color, here is being set to red in this particular declaration. The colon is used to separate the two entities. Declarations are then put together into declaration blocks within curly brackets. So a number of declarations can go inside the curly brackets, and each declaration is separated from the others with a semicolon. And it's good practice to include a semicolon at the very end as well, just before your closing curly bracket. The declaration blocks then are put together with a group of selectors, and these form what's called a CSS rule set, or just simply a rule. So these rules are what form the CSS file, and they're just separated by a space within the file. So the selectors can take a number of different types. Simple selectors match up with one of the elements in your HTML document. So an element selector is a very simple selector, but we can also have other selectors. Attribute selectors will pick out particular elements based on their attributes, and pseudo classes and classes are other types, and ID selectors. So a class is an attribute in the HTML. So you can assign the attribute of a particular class to multiple elements in the HTML document. They can all have the same class value, and then all of those elements with that class value will be given the same CSS rules, and they're represented on CSS by a dot followed by the class name. An ID is also a HTML attribute. Only one element in HTML can have a particular ID, so it's unique. and they're represented in the CSS by the hashtag followed by the ID name. Pseudo classes are used to match one or more elements that exist in a particular state, like for example if the mouse is hovering over them. So there's various ways to combine your selectors. Multiple selectors are just included on the same line, separated by commas. So the same rules will apply to every one of those elements in the select list. So CSS rules allow you to set the value of colors of various items. In CSS, we use color spelled the American way, C-O-L-O-R, and the color gray is also spelled the American way, G-R-A-Y. There's 3 different ways to specify color. You can name the color, you can give the RGB value, the red, green, blue value, or you can give the hexadecimal value. The red, green, and blue value has to be prefixed by the letters RGB, and the 3 values are inserted in brackets. So these values are ranging from 0 up to 255. So 255 indicates that you want the maximum amount of red, for instance, and then in the second value, 0 there indicates that you don't want any green, and 0 in the third value indicates that you don't want any blue. So that particular color would be pure red. But if you want to mix them, you might have, say, 120 in the red and 120 in the green and maybe 105 in the blue, and you get a mix of colors. If you have the maximum amount, 255 in each of those values, then that's actually equivalent to white. White is what you get when you mix all colors together. And black is actually the absence of color, so if you have 3 zeros, then that is black. The hexadecimal numbers are 6 digits, 6 hexadecimal values. They come in pairs, so 2, 2, and 2. So the first 2 is the hexadecimal value for the red. So the 255 turned into hexadecimal is FF. 0 in hexadecimal is 00, 0. And each of those numbers can be turned to its hexadecimal equivalent. If you're giving a hexadecimal value in your CSS, you prefix it by a hashtag, and you include a hashtag at the end also. One of the values that you can choose is to put in the length of something or the size of something. There are 2 different ways to refer to sizes in CSS. The first way is to describe an absolute length. 0.5 centimeters, for exactly, is a fixed length, and it will be the same size no matter what screen it's displayed on, so it's not really ideal. Relative lengths, on the other hand, compare to something else. So for example, the percentage one might be used to say compared to 30% of the width of the screen, if you wanted to say make a image to only cover part of the screen. These are better ways to measure things because they will adapt to moving to multiple different platforms. CSS considers each HTML element as if it's in a box, and you can declare rules that control the values or the appearances of each of the properties of the box that the element inhabits. So for instance, you might wish to control the size of the border. So your HTML and your CMS are pulled together by the browser. So we're going to look a little bit at how the browser does this. If your site has been hosted on a remote server, then instead of just taking the files, the HTML file and the CSS file from your desktop, your browser will actually have to access those files across the internet. So there's lots of different content on the internet, and we're interested in accessing a HTML document. So that means we are going to use the HTTP protocol, which is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. All the documents which are accessible using the HTTP protocol, they make up the www, the World Wide Web, which is a subset of all the possible files that are available over the internet. The way the browser does this is it first connects to the DNS server, the domain name server, and it finds the IP address or the real address of the server where your website is stored. So the DNS server gives the browser the IP address of the correct server, and then your browser sends a HTTP request to that server, asking that it send a copy of the website to you, the client. If the server approves the client's request, then the server starts sending the website's files to the browser as a series of small chunks called data packets. And the browser then assembles the small chunks into a complete website and displays it. So the browser will load the HTML into its memory, into the computer's memory, and it will convert that and the CSS into what's called the DOM, the Document Object Model. So it begins by loading the HTML, and then it parses it up into its various elements, and it creates a tree-like structure using those different elements. And then the browser will load the CSS and break it up into its different elements also using the selectors, and it will attach style to each of the nodes on the tree that it has already created. And once this whole tree has been rendered in memory, it is then rendered to the display.